Hi there, Dan Scott here, and I'm going to show you how I painted this simple landscape with oil paints and brushes. I took the photo at Kingfisher Bay, which is a resort on Fraser Island, or Guri as it's now called. This area caught my eye with all the different greens woven together, the rich blues of the sky, the crisp light colours of the clouds, and the shimmering reflections on the water. All up, this painting took about 2.5 hours, spread over a couple of sessions. I won't show you every stroke I made, rather I'll walk you through a few of the key steps and moments. I start by staining the surface with transparent oxide brown. This will act as a good point of contrast for the cooler blues and greens that I'll layer over the top. I let this dry for about an hour, then I do a very rough sketch. All I'm trying to do here is map out some of the major shapes and lines. This is a simple landscape, so I don't need to go too detailed with the sketch. The more complex the subject, the more detail I'll use. I start working on the darks. If I'm ever unsure where to start in a painting, I typically just jump straight into the darker areas and go from there. The lighter areas of a subject usually require more care and finesse, so I prefer to wait until I'm warmed up before I start working on them. My brushwork here is a bit all over the place. My strategy is to build up a patchwork of broken colour that looks messy up close, but realistic from afar. Notice the variance in my strokes. I'm constantly varying the pressure, direction, and length to convey all the different plants, leaves, and other details. I only use 2 or 3 brushes throughout this entire painting. This may not be best practice, but I prefer to use fewer brushes and just vary the way I use them rather than having to swap all the time. You can get a lot out of a single round or flat brush by simply varying the way you hold it, the pressure of your strokes, the direction you come in at, your overall arm movement, and so on. I also use multicolored strokes all throughout this painting. This involves picking up a few different colours on the brush and leaving them partially unmixed. It's a particularly effective technique for landscape painting. With a single stroke, you can capture all kinds of information and detail. I work my way up through some of the light greens and then up into the sky. The sky plays an important role. It needs to really pop and have that rich and bright appearance. With simple subjects like this, it's essential to get the key features right. Otherwise, it will end up appearing bland and uninteresting. It's much like good cooking. If you're serving a simple meal, any mistakes in your technique or your timings or the quality of the ingredients will stand out, so your execution must be perfect. So don't be fooled into thinking simple subjects are easy. Sometimes you need to work even harder with simple subjects to make the painting appear interesting. For the blue part of the water, there's a colour gradation from dark at the bottom to light around the middle. I use mostly Ultramarine Blue for the very bottom, then I introduce more and more Cobalt Blue and Titanium White as I move up towards the middle of the painting. What I think's happening here with the water is that the dark area at the very bottom isn't reflecting as much light, and we can therefore see down below the surface, where there's probably layers of weed, dead leaves, and other debris. Perhaps this is why the water at the bottom appears so much darker. As we move up in the painting, the water is reflecting more and more light due to the sharper angle. That's why it gets lighter and takes on more of the sky colours. I use more horizontal and repetitive brushwork for the water. This contrasts nicely against the more vertical and varied brushwork that I used for the surrounding greenery. It also makes the water appear more distinct. If I didn't vary the brushwork, it may be hard to tell where the land stops and where the water starts, especially when painting with analogous colours like this. Another strategy you could go with would be to use more refined brushwork and blended colours to pick up the stillness of the water. This would certainly give a more serene and calm feel to the painting, and it would probably be a bit more faithful to the subject. but I just like the appearance of broken strokes to convey water. I use a light blue colour for the reflections of the clouds in the water. It's a rough mix of cobalt blue, titanium white, and a bit of the green that was on my brush. I'm not too worried about the colours from different areas mixing here, as I want it all to melt together anyway. A good tip for painting reflections is to compress the colours. Make the lights a little bit darker and the darks a little bit lighter compared to the real thing. In other words, soften the contrast. So with the reflections of the clouds, I take the edge off the highlights and make them a bit darker than the real thing. I also lean towards blue to suggest the idea of water. For the sky itself, I use much crisper and cleaner colours. I'm quite relaxed with my brushwork, as I want the sky to fit in with the overall impressionistic style of the painting. If I go too fine with the rendering, it might look out of place. I also add a few purples for the darker parts of the clouds. It's only subtle, but it adds a lot of variance and life to the sky. It takes it from being a play between blue and white to a more dynamic play between blue, purple and white. Each additional colour increases the number of relationships exponentially. It's not linear. Notice how I jump back and forth between the sky and the water. When I'm painting with broken colour like this, I often like to jump between different areas that share similar colours. This way I can build up subtle colour links throughout the painting. Here I make a bit of a mistake with the water lilies. I get the colour temperature wrong, and I make the lilies too cool in relation to the surroundings. The colour might have been okay, but I was far too liberal with it at the very least. When you make a mistake like this, it's important to slow down and not be too quick to fix it. Sometimes what appears as a mistake is actually a step in the right direction, and all that's needed is to fill in the rest of the painting. But in this case, I think it's actually a mistake. The colour just doesn't read well, and most of the other colours are broadly in place. The first thing I do is weave in some warmer greens. This will help counter the colours which are too cool. I then break up the water lilies a bit by carving out more area for the reflections. I also fix the colours of the reflections by adding lighter colours for the clouds and darker colours for some of the trees. The water lilies are starting to read a bit better now with these changes. A good lesson here is that sometimes the solution to a problem in a painting isn't a single big change, but many small adjustments that add up over time. I go over the water and weave in some lighter blues to match the sky, and I make sure to retain that gradation from dark to light. I want the blues in this painting to be as rich and as crisp as possible without it appearing overdone. I paint in some of the highlights on the water using a rough mix of cadmium green, cadmium yellow and titanium white. This painting doesn't have a strong focal point, but if I had to pick one, it would be around these highlights. They add a subtle and delicate touch to the painting, and I would say these are the most careful strokes I've made. I also pick up some of the highlights on the plants and trees at the back. As I do this, I'm thinking about which areas are being hit with direct sunlight and which areas are shielded from it. And I'm careful not to overdo it. With highlights, less is usually more. I go back around the greenery at the sides and at the bottom to make sure it's dark enough and to fill in any gaps. This area acts as a frame that contains our attention on the water in the middle. For it to be effective, it needs to be dark enough and solid enough. For the finishing touches, I add a few more highlights to the trees in the back and the clouds. These highlights are like the final exclamation point in the painting, and they add the contrast needed for that crisp finish. And that does it for this painting. I want to stop whilst it appears fresh and spontaneous. I mark the painting complete by signing it in the bottom left corner using a round brush and magenta. Here's the finished painting alongside the reference photo. Keep in mind, I wasn't trying to copy the reference photo, so it's not a perfect recreation. The photo was just a guide for me and a reminder of what my first impressions were of the subject. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. I also have a free landscape painting workshop that you might find interesting. I'll put a link to that in the description below the video. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next one.